Well, good morning, everybody, to week 3 of the crop hour. Today, welcome if you're here for the first time, and welcome back if you were with us yesterday. We covered soybean yesterday. Today, we're gonna talk about sunflower. In the past, the insect pests that are most commonly found or of most concern in South Dakota. Some quick things about the crop hour if you haven't attended before. We encourage you to ask any questions, and if you have any, down at the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A button you can click on. It showed it in our first few slides before the webinar started. That, or you can use the chat as well. Just at any time, if you have any questions, type that into either of those, and we'll try to answer those questions after the presentation. Another thing to keep in mind, if you are a certified crop advisor and you want credits, it's a little different this year. You'll have to pay ahead of time and sit through the whole presentation, and then we'll handle getting those credits to you after the presentation. So with that, we have two speakers today, same as yesterday. The first one is Dr. Adam Varenhorst. He's an associate professor and extension field crop entomologist, and he's going to cover red sunflower seed weevil. So with that, take it away, Adam.
All right. Well, thank you, Phil. And as the title suggests, and if anyone here grows red sun or sunflowers, you'll know that red sunflower seed weevils are a major issue here in South Dakota. And so the big question we get is management possible? And hopefully we'll be able to go through some of the potential management options today. And I'd like to thank my collaborators. You can see here, I have several, including Phil and Patrick at SDSU, as well as Jan Knodel in her lab at NDSU. So the red sunflower seed weevil isn't a new pest sunflower. It's actually a native pest. And so it's been an issue for us as long as sunflower has been produced in the country. And the big issue we have with red sunflower seed weevils and just sunflower in general is sunflower production didn't really take off in the US. The sunflowers actually made their way to Europe where they were improved. The genetics were improved and a lot of the hybrids that were high yielding were developed. And then they were brought back to North America and eventually they gained popularity in the US. And one of the issues with that is that when you take something away from its native area where there are naturally occurring insect populations or diseases that will affect it, and you start breeding it somewhere where none of those exist, well, you don't get that development of those resistance traits. And so when everything got brought back and we started growing sunflowers in the US, it wasn't too long before the red sunflower seed weevil and a lot of other insects became major problems. And so, all the way back to 1946, there was a researcher who, looking at the data and looking at sunflower production in Illinois and Missouri, attributed the rapid decline in production in those two states to red sunflower seed weevil pressure. Specifically, they just didn't have anything they could do to really slow the population down, and the damage was too severe. So they said no more. And they came back a little bit during World War II and then declined again. But if we think about rapid declines, we actually maybe experienced a little bit of a rapid decline in sunflower production even in South Dakota just a couple years ago. And on the slide here, we can see several years of the acres planted. That's kind of the metric I was looking at, how many acres were being planted in South Dakota. And historically, there's been kind of a back and forth battle between North Dakota and South Dakota on which state has the most sunflower production occurring from a year to year. And so if we look, our average at those numbers from 2017 to 2022 is about 587,000 acres planted, and the error around that average was 21,558. And so using a little bit of math that we can apply to statistics, we look for outliers a lot of times, so data that doesn't make sense. And one of the things that you do is you look for anything that's over a certain amount of your standard error. And so the kind of a rule of thumb is 2.5 times greater or lower than your standard error is an outlier. And so for our data, we're looking for any data points that are less than 533,105 acres. Those are going to be designated as outliers. And if we look at 2023 and 2024 sunflower production acres, we were actually below that. So we had two outliers in just the last few years. in terms of reduced sunflower acreage. Now, can we attribute all of that to red sunflower seed weevils? No, of course not. But they definitely had an impact, in my opinion, because the two things that were driving a lot of the reduction in acres are commodity price as well as pest pressure and the inability to really manage it well. But the good news, other than the fact that we did have some rapid decline, is that if we look at the 2025 data, we bounced back a little bit from that 2024. And so we're still in the ballpark of being an outlier year, but in my opinion, that looks a lot better than continued decrease. And so sunflowers are a major commodity here in South Dakota, and they represent, as you can see, roughly 500,000 acres from year to year and have some value to the state. And, if anybody has purchased bird seed, a lot of times those seeds are being grown in North Dakota, South Dakota, and then there's also the oil and the confections that are used for sunflower seeds. So there's a lot of value to us in the US, and hopefully we can keep them around. But the big issue is with the production, I mentioned red sunflower seed weevils are probably a large part of decreased acres. And if we look from 2021 and 2023, this is data that was put together based on surveys that are done by the National Sunflower Association. Back in 2019, we had our obvious hotspot of red sunflower seed weevils. But what's happened is that there's been continued increases in the red sunflower seed weevil populations. And for those of us who work in sunflower, this isn't a surprise to see this kind of data on a graph or a figure because we've seen it out in the field. But essentially, the populations have just really been taking off. And short of, potential weather effects and maybe the management's not working as well, it's hard to say exactly what's going on. If we look up into North Dakota, though, as well, we see that there's been increases there. Not as much as here in South Dakota, but they've been seeing some increased populations as well. So the bigger problem for us in South Dakota is that we have these very large populations that were continuing to grow for the last few years. And to give you all an idea, the threshold for red sunflower seed weevils and oil seed varieties is 4 to 6 weevils per head. And we were out scouting fields that were 10 to 1,000 times over the threshold. So we are seeing thousands of these weevil adults per head. And then in addition to that, we had these first reports of pyrethroid field failures. So pesticides were sprayed, the insecticides were sprayed, and nothing happened. And initially there was thoughts that maybe there's this very large population, so it's hard to tell if the weevils are being knocked down or maybe too low of rates were being used. And so we started investigating a little bit. But when we were out in these fields, we saw obvious evidence that there were very large weevil populations in the sunflower. If you're familiar with this pest, you know that the populations tend to be much higher around field edges. And so this was an idea of how bad it was on a field edge and just seeing thousands. As we moved into the field, though, we were still seeing a lot of weevils. And so remember that on oil seeds, it's 4 to 6. And if you look carefully, you can see really quickly we had more than 4 to 6, just even on the ray petals. But if I blow that up a little bit, we were at max capacity pretty much. We had standing room only left for these weevils because they actually like to go down in between these little, they're called achenes, the flowerets, and they'll kind of hide out there. And what we had in South Dakota was that we actually had such a load of these weevils per head that they were essentially just sitting on top of one another. And so just very high populations. And all of this was further complicated with the recent history with chlorpyrifos in EPA changing the tolerances and then now not having it labeled for sunflower production because we had these pyrethroid failures. And so the next thought would be that we'd switch pretty much just to chlorpyrifos until we solve our problem or found something else that worked. And back in about 5 years, 3 to 4 years ago, we had where we couldn't use it, and then we got it back for a year, and then now we don't have it again. And as you can see here, after the June 30th, 2025, you can use chlorpyrifos in alfalfa, soybean, sugar beet, and spring wheat, winter wheat, not sunflower. And so this is a big hit for us because we have these pests that are at very large populations and we don't have a lot of management tools. Fortunately, Tom Gear with the state of South Dakota worked very diligently and ensured that we got a 24C, so a special label for malathion. And just for anyone that's unfamiliar, that's effective each year from July 15th through August 31st. So kind of our prime red sunflower seed weevil spraying period. And that is active until December 31st, 2030. So for the next few years, we can still use malathion legally during that time frame in July to August. Big thing though, based on some conversations we've had in the last years, it's very important that we follow the label. There are quite a few restrictions because it is a special needs label. And the other thing is that there's one rate. And so this year I was visiting with some individuals that were using malathion and they told me the rate that was being used and it was actually below the labeled rate. And that gets into a little bit of an issue because we only have one number you can choose from. So that's what we need to use. From years of research with North Dakota, we've put together a lot of data looking at red sunflower seed weevil. And I think this figure here really takes home the message of we look up in North Dakota for the last few years. So essentially 2020 to 2024, they had no issues. Every population they tested came back as being highly susceptible, 100% mortality. So the insecticides were just working perfectly. Now you compare that to us here in South Dakota, and we have, for the most part, highly resistant red sunflower seed weevils. There's a few populations that'll show up that are moderately resistant, and then we still have a few isolated pockets where insecticides aren't used, and those are still susceptible. But for the most part, where we do have increased sunflower production, we do have resistance to the pyrethroid class. And so that's kind of our focal point. This is where our first reports came from. And it makes sense that that's where we're having our most issues today. And I'm going to run through just some data from the last few years. And so this is from an assay we did. So we went out and collected red sunflower seed weevils. We put them in treated vials, and then we counted to see how many died. And so we want to see everything at 100%. These bars ideally would all be at 100% mortality. And that would mean that everything worked perfectly. We have no problems in South Dakota. This gray bar up here represents the North Dakota population, which we use for control. The white bars were not significantly different from the control. And if they have the hash marks, they were. So that means resistance. And so as we go through, we see that for 2020, we tested 4 counties here in South Dakota, numerous locations within each county. So it wasn't just one field per county. But what we saw was that for Warrior 2, Asana XL, and Zypermethrin, so we used Zypermethrin here. We wanted to use Mustang Max, but we could not get the technical grade, very high grade Zeta Zypermethrin. So instead we use Zypermethrin. So should be fairly similar, but as we saw, it was not working very well in 2020. And so essentially what we saw is that in Hughes and Sully County, we had pyrethroid resistance to 3 of the products that we tested. In 2021, we see pretty much the same story, except we tested a lot more populations from additional counties. And what we saw is that pretty much all but Stanley County had resistance to Warrior 2. We had Lyman, Stanley, and Hawken that did not have resistance to Asana. Otherwise, everything else did. And then for the Zypermethrin, nothing looked good. And so we ended up, this was the last year we tested the Zypermethrin because the writing was on the wall. It just was not going to be an option. It's not labeled for sunflower in the Zypermethrin form. So we said, let's just remove it. And so the third year of this study, we looked at Asana XL with the PBO, so Exponent or one of the other Synergist products, and then Warrior 2. And this was, we thought, really interesting in the lab because when we tested the Asana, all but 3 counties had resistance in South Dakota. But when we added that PBO, things really changed. And you'll notice we have a lot of white bars now. And that means that things are actually working better. And that told us 2 things. The first is that the PBO really increased the efficacy in the lab. But it also told us that the method of the resistance was mostly likely due to some enzyme group. And that gives us an idea for maybe how to manipulate that going into the future. The catch here is that after 2022, we started recommending that farmers use the PBO out in the field. and we got an avalanche of reports that nothing worked. That's kind of an interesting result, but if we think about a lab setting, they're in these tiny little vials, they're forced to be in contact with the insecticide, and maybe it's the best case scenario. But the good news is we found out a little bit about what the resistance was due to, and we tested the Warrior, and pretty much nothing looked great, except for Meade County and Hyde County. It just had a lot of variability, but looked very poor too. And so the takeaway from that data is that we have resistance to pyrethroids, confirmed resistance here in South Dakota. And the next question is well, what do we do about it? And that's a great question. And right now, what we've been doing for the last couple of years is we're testing pretty much every product that exists to see if anything works. And so for the last few years, we've been doing these efficacy studies in farmer fields in central South Dakota. You can see we've been testing a lot of products, so 15 treatments. And then we've even been playing with spraying on different dates. So we plant early, we spray those a little bit earlier. We plant later, we spray those. And there's another reason for the planting date, and that's some other research we've done and to test whether or not some data from the 1980s from North Dakota still was relevant. But essentially trying a lot of different options to get the best management possible. And so for 2025, our results here, these are our different treatments over here. And you can see we've been playing around. So we're still occasionally adding exponent to treatments. And then we've also started trying some crop oil because we had one year where we put crop oil in a couple of treatments and it looked promising. But over here is our pounds per acre for yield on the x-axis. And what we notice is that nothing has a letter next to it. And that's bad news because that means nothing stood out. And so as we look forward at this early planting date, we see that everything was pretty closely grouped together. Here's our untreated control. We would have ideally had everything be significantly different from that, but nothing was. So that was our early planting. And then if we look at our late planting, it's pretty much the same story. So the untreated control was one of our higher yielding treatments, and everything else was pretty close to it. And so nothing stood out, and that's been a trend here for the last few years and kind of disappointing for us as researchers because we're hoping to find something eventually that works. What's more interesting to us is that when we were looking at the yields between the early and late planting, the early planting was significantly lower than the late planting. And you'll hear a lot in South Dakota about that there's a lot of push towards late planting for sunflowers because a lot of times there's yield benefits. Well, maybe we saw that this year. And it was, yeah, for our data, it was 479 pound per acre difference, which is not a small amount in terms of yield. But what's interesting to us is that I mentioned that planting date study we've been doing, and this is from our 2023 results. And what we've seen for years with red sunflower seed weevils is if we plant earlier in May, we have people in South Dakota planting sunflowers actually at the end of April now. But what we see is that we get increased yield compared to the later June dates. And then we also have reduced red sunflower seed weevil damage. And as a result of that, we have typically higher oil percentage. And the reason for this is if you can plant early enough, you can actually avoid when red sunflower seed weevils are a problem in the field. Now, if we think back, our planting date was the first week of June and then a couple weeks later. One of the things I think happened in 2025, just due to the ability to get in the field in a timely manner, I think we missed our optimal window for early planting. And I think we may have found something for a future research project because I think if we plant at the wrong time in June, so you can see for the most part, we were looking here, if we plant sometime at the very end of June, it's very bad for the most part. But for us in 2025, it seemed like that first week of June maybe made us a target because of the rest of the fields in the area. But for the most part, the data show consistently that if you plant early May, you're going to have increased yields, decreased weevil damage, and increased oil content, which is important. The other thing, though, to note is that we aren't getting down to 0% weevil damage with planting date. And so we are still recommending that if you want to decrease the pressure of the weevils are having on your sunflower fields, consider planting early. But it's important to note that you're still not below that 2% damage threshold, which for the most part, when you go to market, it's necessary. but it's getting us a lot closer than 68 to 70%, which we see a lot of times otherwise. When we look at the 2025 data for the seed damage, what we see is that we saw some numerical trends. Malathion had in the ballpark of the lowest, but nothing stood out significantly different from one another, meaning that we can't say Malathion's going to work great for us. But what we do know is that when we don't have the data completely done yet, but Phil's actively been working on this. And to give you guys an idea of why it takes so long, we harvest the seeds and then we have to sit and look at 9,000 seeds to see whether or not there's a hole in them from the red sunflower seed weevil larva coming out. And so it's just a time-intensive project. But what we've noticed so far is the late planting in 2025 seems to have much less damage across all the treatments. And so that kind of sticks with the maybe our early planting was the bullseye for the red sunflower seed weevil. The timing was just right this year that one was the one they came out, they found, and they hit the hardest. But once we get that data, we'll have to see how that really looks. Now I'm going to switch from South Dakota to North Dakota. And so I said North Dakota has been working with us on these projects for years now. And for the most part, they've had zero issues, except in the last couple of years, North Dakota has been receiving failure reports. And that's kind of how it started for us here in South Dakota. We had a one-off report. A year later, we had a few more reports, and then it became very obvious that we had a major problem. And so in North Dakota this year, they collected red sunflower seed weevils from a couple locations west of Bismarck. And it's not very complicated. We go out and we grab the weevils right off the head, and then we come back to the lab and put them in vials and see what happens. And so if we look at the North Dakota data, and I have inside information because I've been looking at their data for years, but for the last 5 years before this, their percent mortalities in their tested populations were always 100%. And so what we see right away then is when we look at this data from 2025, they're quite a bit under, and especially for delta methorin and lambda cyhalothrin. So this would be delta gold and warrior 2. They're quite a bit below 100. And when I was looking at this data for the first time, I pretty much knew instantly that there's an issue here. And then if we look, Jan went through and calculated the LC50, which is 50% of the concentration of the chemical that would take to kill 50% of the population. And then this would be chemical it takes to kill 90%. And what she saw is that for the 90%, she actually jumped above the 1x field rate, so what you can legally apply. And so that means that there's some resistance starting to show up in North Dakota. Now, it's not a huge surprise for the researchers who have been working on this because we don't know how far the weevils move. We do know they fly, they can move around, and it was probably just a matter of time before they found those North Dakota sunflower fields and the populations started to take off. And so those populations are a little bit troubling. But in conclusion, from the data we looked at for South Dakota, management for red sunflower seed weevils is probably not going to be reliant on insecticides for the near future until we figure out some of the reasons why things just aren't working, even when we test them in the field. They look like they might work in the lab. When we go out to the field, things change. Big thing for us here in South Dakota is we had malathion failure reports in 2025 from a couple locations in central and western South Dakota. And so it's time that we get out and start testing that. It's been used for a couple of years. It's closely related to chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos was used for a number of years, and so there's a potential that resistance has already been developed, and it just took a little bit of time for it to show up against the malathion. For North Dakota, I would say that from my perspective, trouble's on the horizon. Unfortunately, it's probably coming from us in terms of those populations moving around because we have production right up to the border. So it makes sense that eventually they're going to cross state lines. Insects don't see those boundaries. And so North Dakota is really going to need to keep an eye on those red sunflower seed weevil populations in their sunflower to make sure they don't get caught off guard and have huge populations take off. And although our 2025 data kind of threw the planting date for a loop, in terms of overall management, I would say that planting date still looks like one of our most promising options. And the reason for that is it does require a little bit of change in the spring because you have to rotate what crop's going in first. But by reducing that damage, one of the things we've been trying to see is if we can reduce the amount of pressure we have if we use an insecticide or another management option, can we further reduce it and maybe get to where we're below threshold for damage? And so that's in the works for the upcoming year. And we have a lot of other projects going on with red sunflower seed weevil. We're still really focused on trying to figure out something to manage it. And to give you guys an idea, we're going down a pretty deep rabbit hole. So we're looking at biological products, so things that use bacteria, trying to kill the weevils. We're looking at anti-fedant, something we can spray that makes the weevils not want to take a bite out of that pollen, and also anything we can do to deter them from finding the field or just making the field less accessible visually. And so one of the big things we are hopefully going to get done in this upcoming year is figuring out exactly how far these weevils can fly. It's going to be very important that happens, especially with what's being found up in North Dakota, so that we can figure out how fast things are going to spread for them. And, we have a lot of ongoing stuff too. One of the things we think might be going on with these weevils is insects have essentially a wax layer on the outside of their body. It keeps the moisture in. But if you've messed around with wax, it also can keep things out. And what we think might be happening is that these resistant weevils, uh, they might have a thicker layer of that wax, which is making all of the products not work as well. And so they're resistant to a few, but they're essentially uh, tolerant of a lot because we just can't get the product into them. And so we're still trying to figure that out. And if we do figure that out, we'll hopefully be able to scratch the whiteboard and figure out exactly how to get the chemicals down to them. So sorry about that. If you guys hear that, my phone apparently has a weather alert going off. But with that, I'll pass things back to Phil here. I have a few more slides for your general information. And if you need to get a hold of me or if you have further questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You're always welcome to come visit me in my office on campus. Probably the easier option, though, is to give me a phone call at the number here or send me an email. And if you have any other questions unrelated to weevils, also feel free to contact me about those too. So thanks a lot for your time.
All right, thank you, Adam. Uh, we'll have Pat get his slides up, but with that, we do have one question. Is the population reduced if all growers in an area skip a year of production?
That's a great question. And I did forget to mention during the talk, so we were seeing those really large weevil populations for years. And then if you remember last winter, it was very cold and there was not a lot of snow cover. And in 2025, we actually saw reduced red sunflower seed weevil numbers. Now we are still way over threshold. We are at the 50 to 100 mark. But from what we've been seeing for years, that's pretty optimistic numbers for us because, we've dropped from the thousands. Now, back to your question, uh, you know, there's been a lot of debate. Jared Pacifica, who's at the USDA in Fargo, and I have talked about this. Realistically, it would take probably a statewide effort to really knock the weevil populations down. So essentially a rest period where we switch off a sunflower. There's obviously going to be some issues with that. Sunflower production ceases to exist for a year. Things are going to kind of have a long, few year lasting impact probably from that. One of the other things is that, we do have a lot of wild sunflowers. Now they're not maybe as great of a host, but the weevils do use those. So, uh, we've talked about it, and essentially what we think would have to be is, as you said, it would have to be uh, area wide and maybe statewide. And uh, the other question is how long would it take? It might be actually a couple years because there'd be enough wild population of the sunflowers out in the road ditches and uh, unused areas that they stick around for a little bit. But eventually, we do think that the numbers would decrease. So, but we haven't signed on to that plan just because of the economic issues we'd probably see with that in terms of just knocking all the sunflower production out. But that is a possibility. And if you're able, whoever asked that, if you're able to organize that, uh, good luck. So thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Adam. That concludes the sunflower part of the presentation. Now we'll move on to Patrick Wagner. He's a Extension Entomology Field Specialist based out of Rapid City, and he knows alfalfa pretty good. A lot of insects in that. So he's gonna cover, uh, as you can see on the slide, some blister beetle and grasshopper outlook. So with that, go ahead, Pat.
All right, thanks, Phil. Yeah, so for the rest of the hour here, we're going to focus on just a few forage pests. Of course, starting with alfalfa weevil, and then, as Phil mentioned, there's some grasshoppers and blister beetles, because those are kind of certainly two related pests that we see every year. And of course, I've included Adam Varenhorst and Phil Roseboom on these slides as well, because they've definitely contributed to any of these research efforts and stuff as well. So to get things started, just focusing on alfalfa weevil, I'm sure a lot of you on here are already well aware of this insect if you're in South Dakota. This is what the adult beetles look like. Kind of have this long snout and then kind of that light brown with a dark brown stripe down the back. And then you'll have the larvae, or these just small green worms that they have a white stripe that runs down their top line. So with alfalfa weevils, they do affect that first cutting. Usually we see them, as soon as things start to green up, they can start getting active. Certainly one of the first pests that we'll see out in alfalfa. And they really just kind of hang around there through that first cutting, and can even, after that first harvest, if you do a second cutting, they can affect that regrowth, so they can cause some stunting of the plants. So the larvae, they're going to be feeding on the terminal buds and the new leaves that you're going to see them towards the top of the plants. There's going to be some holes, and I'll show some pictures of kind of what that looks like. But yeah, typically kind of those circular holes just on the top leaves, but really the whole plants can end up having some defoliation to some degree. So this is kind of worst case scenario. These photos I took out at the West River Research Farm out by Sturgis. We didn't do any insecticide applications on these. Just kind of wanted to see how bad it could get. And you can see this was, we ended up, I think, probably harvesting this the next day, because there would have hardly been anything left. But you can see on those, in this photo on the left, that there's this kind of frosted appearance to the leaves, just really heavy defoliation up at the top, more that kind of lightish tan color, and then it gets a little more green as you go further down. But the tops of the plants are just, nearly skeletonized. And then if you run a sweep net through it, so you might look at that field, and yes, you can see the damage, but you might not actually see the bugs on there. Well, run a sweep net through, and I think maybe this was like 10 sweeps with just a standard 15-inch diameter sweep net, and we were just catching tons of these things. So this is, again, there's where the what the larvae look like, and they're in all different instars, or kind of those life stages. You have some of them that are pretty big and fat, and they're about, ready to pupate, and then you have others that just hatched out and are still going. So you kind of have that kind of a longer, maybe not emergence window there, but yeah, when they're hatching. So in terms of management, and then here's another photo here that I don't remember where this was actually taken from, but this was kind of shows sometimes in the field it can be a little spotty, so you can have, an edge effect, or just patches in the field that you can see where that frosting is kind of along maybe the left side and towards the foreground there, but then other parts there that are still pretty green. But in terms of management, early harvest, That's one of the things is just, getting that alfalfa out of the field before the weevils can really cause too much damage to it. There's not a lot of research to back this up, but with cultural control doing like spring cultivation using a spring tooth harrow or disc that you're kind of agitating like the crown of the plant there and trying to get those plants to start growing earlier, kind of jumpstart everything so that you can do that earlier harvest if possible. And then the other thing too is like fall grazing. I know with sheep or even cattle, especially sheep, though, they'll actually seek out some of the larvae, and then you can have some trampling action there on the stubble there in the fall that will kind of eliminate some of those overwintering or ones that are going to be overwintering there at the base of the plants. Of course, not a silver bullet by any means, just trying to really reduce the numbers as much as possible there with any of those methods. But our main control management tactic here is with foliar insecticides. So this kind of brings up the first research study here that the working group here was. I actually wasn't involved with this one. It was more East River there. That was Adam, Phil, and Brad McManus. And it addressed some concerns for that there was some insecticide resistance. Producers reporting that there were failed applications or they weren't getting a very good kill. Well, kind of wanted to look at what test some different products and see what was still working and if there's any issues or things that might not be working as well. So they did a field test and evaluated several different products. This is over a 2-year study. So there was that Imidan, that was the organophosphate. They used silencer, and Warrior, that's the lambda-cyhalothrin, and then Mustang Max, zeta-cypermethrin, Asana, and then Steward was the indoxacarb product. So for the experimental design, this was conducted out at the Northeast Research Farm, and they did a randomized complete block design. Again, as I mentioned, it was a 2-year study, and those insecticides were applied in June, both years there, kind of early June, June 8th, and then June 10th. That was 23 and 2024. And then they went back and counted the number of weevils there per 30 stems 4 days following that insecticide application. So here are the results from 2023. And on the x-axis there, you have the different products and then that were used. And on the y-axis, there's the number of, or average number of weevils per 30 stems. So we can see in 23, when they tested Imidan, that was, actually worse than the untreated control, although not significantly different there. But we can really see a good kill there still with the silencer, Steward, and then the Imidan plus silencer. That was a combination there. And in 2024, again, there's the untreated control, and you can see a lot of these other products. They didn't test the Imidan there the second year. That was Mustang Max, and I think Steward and Asana were a little bit different there, but all of those seem to work pretty well. And to kind of summarize this, we could see that the phosmets or the Imidan, the organophosphate, really, didn't work very well for alfalfa weevils, and it's generally not recommended for control. But we could see at least, in that part of the state there that the lambda-cy, zeta-cypermethrin, all those other products still prove effective, that they work just fine out in the field. And I know on that last one, for 23, when they had Imidan and silencer, it really, that was a combination, but I think it was silencer alone really that seemed to be the champion there that kept the numbers down. I don't think Imidan probably did much of anything on that application. So then this kind of brought up the question of, well, what about other alfalfa weevil populations that are across the state? So especially, I'm based in Rapid City, and I've had questions from or reports from producers out this way of, more of those, well, there's resistant weevils, things aren't working. Um, so yeah, maybe these products look good in the Northeast, but what about other parts of the state? So just in this last year, 2025, we kind of got onto NDSU was running a bioassay, just a laboratory uh, test on different products for alfalfa weevil. And yeah, we got in on that as well. Um, I went out to the West River Research Farm out by Sturgis and tested those larvae in the vials. This was a very similar design to what Adam was sharing earlier with the red sunflower seed weevil study. So we just had vials of different rates of insecticides, and then kind of saw, just to test what works and what didn't. And really, I mean, it didn't come as any big surprise here that we did have some evidence of resistance out west. So again, this is just one location around Meade County, but I mean, there's a lot of alfalfa production, certainly in Meade and Butte County, especially around the Belle Fourche area. And that's typically where I've heard more of these issues with insecticide resistance. So if we look at Warrior 2 on this graph, on the x-axis there, you have the proportion of a 1x rate, and then your mortality there is on the y-axis. So we can see, at these anything, fractions of a 1x rate, it just kind of gets worse the less that we put on there. But even at, a full rate, that 1x, you're still only getting, that's maybe 75% mortality, which is not great. You still have 25% of the population that's still out in the field. The LD50 there was calculated about 1.26 times higher than the highest labeled rate. And then the LD90 there is about 19 times higher. So another product that was tested was Steward, although the data with that was pretty messy. It did look like it was even worse than Warrior, but we do need to we want to retest that product for sure. But this is definitely something that we're going to look into further. Again, didn't come as a huge surprise, but yeah, it's kind of good to actually have some data to back up some of the resistance claims that we've had in the area. So the next thing, now we're going to kind of switch gears from alfalfa weevils and talk about the other two insects that I wanted to focus on. And one, of course, is grasshoppers. Everyone's always interested about those here for the coming season. And then blister beetles as well. And I'll talk about kind of that relationship with those between those two here in a little bit. So starting with grasshoppers, and this is if you were on yesterday, I know Phil shared this figure, but I kind of wanted to show it again because it really is. It kind of sets the stage, I guess, for these populations here for the coming year. So this graph here shows the 2025 first freeze dates that we experienced this past fall. And you can see there are actually some blue areas that was, this is a 28-degree freeze. So that's a killing frost. Anything above that, yeah, you're not going to get nearly as much knockdown on the insect population. But at that 28-degree point, that's really when that grasshopper activity, a lot of that egg laying and stuff comes to a halt. But again, you can see some of these blue areas. West River here, we did have some spots that had a September freeze. A lot more of the state though was in the green areas where we had, that was early to mid October. And then one thing that was a little concerning there is on the east end of the state, we had, well, really kind of east central, there's pockets of that we didn't have a first hard freeze until, early to mid-November. So that means, I mean, the grasshoppers, if you already had a pretty substantial population um, during that growing season and into the fall, they were just going to keep laying eggs and hanging out there until that first frost. I mean, that's clear into November. So those pockets of the late freeze is kind of where we want to. If you live in one of those areas, you have cropland there, it might be something worth keeping an eye on. That you might expect to see higher populations of grasshoppers here this next year. If we look at current conditions, the other thing that's a big factor with grasshoppers is drought conditions. So drought obviously favors grasshoppers. They like that dry weather. There's a fungal pathogen that's kind of a uh, natural enemy of these insects that will keep the numbers down. But if you have dry weather, while you're certainly going to have uh, that's there's a lot less that's going against those grasshoppers. So typically we kind of look at any of those areas that have drier conditions that as we get into more spring and into summer, of course, it's going to have a bigger impact. But even now we can kind of look and there's a lot of winter left. We could have some big snowstorms possibly that could change the way this looks. But currently, yeah, if you're in the southeast corner of the state there, that yeah, if you had a late freeze and now you're having some dry conditions, if that moderate drought continues into the growing season, yeah, you might have some pretty substantial grasshopper pressure. So we did also have some patchy outbreaks in 2025. So if you're in any of those areas that had larger populations last year, of course, that might be that can carry over into this next year. And then, yeah, it has been a mild winter thus far. So that's another thing that, yeah, if you have not a lot of snow cover and pretty cold temperatures that frost can penetrate down. I know that's bad for plants, of course, but it also helps kill off some of those insects that are overwintering. So that's something also to consider there. If we don't have really cold temperatures and stuff, yeah, you might have higher survival of grasshoppers and a lot of other insect pests too, for that matter. So what to expect in 2026? Well, I've kind of gone over a lot of these things already. This picture here, this was taken out by, I believe this was the Belfouche area, that they had, yeah, just absolutely worst case scenario. You had a drought and then a lot of bare ground, and you can have this just tons of grasshoppers just hanging out laying eggs. I believe this photo was taken in October. Not this last year. I think this photo was from a couple of years ago. But certainly watch areas that are currently experiencing drought, or if they had a late freeze in 2025. Again, that late freeze means there's extra egg laying that can occur in the fall. A cold winter and then too a wet spring would certainly help keep the numbers down. If we can kind of ramp up the fungal pathogen there early in the season and knock them down before they get too out of hand. The big thing though is, yeah, you just want to scout for grasshoppers regardless of where you're at. If certainly more so if you're in one of those higher risk areas, but yeah, take a sweep net out there and check and see what you got. So here's an example of why scouting is important. And more importantly, too, is checking even adjacent hayfields next to cropland. So these photos here, this was from this past year that we had a producer that had planted sunflowers pretty late in the season. That was, in July there that these things were coming up, and it was kind of alarming to them that, well, suddenly like half of the field there just seemed to die off, that there was just nothing. And as we look, off to the left here, so that's that middle picture towards where all these sunflowers are just gone. That looks like some round bales out there, and that's a hayfield. And if we take a closer look at the plants here on the right hand side, this picture shows the just complete skeletonate, or these plants are completely skeletonized. What was a sunflower plant is now just sticks in the ground. So it's very important, if to pay attention if you have a hayfield, and this goes too for like road ditches, any right of ways that are getting harvested for hay, draws, anything like that. If those areas have a lot of grasshoppers, sometimes it's in your best interest to just leave those areas for the grasshoppers to eat. Because if you go and cut that hay, they got to find the next thing that's green to consume. And if it's right next to a delicious green crop field, even broadleaf here like sunflowers, they're going to just go right in, move right into that field and feed on the next thing. So you're going to actually be causing yourself more problems, harvesting that hay than you would otherwise. Because then, you're basically just leaving it would have a crop, or a trap crop. Even just leaving strips of it is better than just completely cutting the whole works. That's, again, just very important to check those adjacent hay fields and stuff that are next to crop fields before you go and hay them. Something else to mention is that grass hay mixes can get hit a little bit harder than if you have just a alfalfa monoculture out there. Grasshoppers, they're going to go to those grassy plants first. That's going to be most attractive for them. So it seems to be more common here West River that we'll see more of the alfalfa and grass mixes. But that's something else. If you have a mixture like that, might be worth or keeping an eye on there than if you just have a complete alfalfa stand. So talking about management here, just with thresholds, of course, use the 15-inch diameter sweep net, like I mentioned. The economic threshold is 8 to 10 adults per square yard, or 15 to 20 nymphs. And you can do the pendulum sweeps, or you can even picture like a square yard in your mind, and walk towards that spot and try to count the number of grasshoppers jumping out of there. But a sweep net makes this a whole lot easier. And then this diagram here shows kind of an example of a pattern that you can follow. There can certainly be an edge effect, towards the field road there, or the fence. And then as you get further in, it might not be quite as many grasshoppers, but certainly a good idea to get a broad representation there of the whole field there, instead of just like a couple spots there along the fence line. So preventative treatments there, of course, there are fungal and poison baits. Those have definitely been in limited availability here the past several years. You can use insect growth regulators, or those IGRs work really great. There's been some counties that have done just aerial applications of those IGRs early in the season. That's the key thing, because you want to get them when they're still in the nymphal stages, like this grasshopper here. Just has the little, the wing buds there. It's not fully developed yet. Yeah, if you spray an insect growth regulator on a adult grasshopper, they're done growing, so it's not going to do anything to them. It's something that you want to do early on in the season. As I mentioned too, leaving uncut strips of that hay ground there, and treat those with an insecticide. And then too, you can have, even like treating the stubble after harvest there. It might be best to do that in some cases, because if it's, you want to try to avoid that pre-harvest interval, pay attention to what insecticides that you're using. That, maybe if it's a 14-day grazing or haying restriction or something, certainly be cognizant of that. Okay, so then this moves on to the last insect that I want to talk about, and this is blister beetles. So these, they have that elongate body, about a half to an inch long, narrow thorax, will vary in color based on the species, and these adults are going to be uh, herbivores, and then they'll feed on like the leaves, flowers, pollen, pretty much anything. They're really attracted to the flowering crops. So certainly, if you're alfalfa, if you're late getting it out of there and it goes into full bloom, it just becomes a magnet for these blister beetles to go in. And then the larvae are actually predatory. So quickly on their life cycle here, they will overwinter as a pseudopupa. They pupate in the spring. They'll emerge in June. We really see these populations ramp up. Seems like about the 4th of July is when I start getting calls about them. And then they lay eggs in the summer and the fall, and the larvae will actually feed on grasshopper eggs. So that's where you see that relationship. If you have a lot of grasshoppers, a lot of egg laying going on, that's an abundant food source for those blister beetles. So you might see a lot more of them showing up on any given year. So why are they an issue? Well, blister beetles, they contain a chemical called cantharidin. And, as their name implies there, that cantharidin, if those beetles are crushed, it can be released, and then it can be harmful to livestock because it can cause blistering, can make a lot of animals sick, and with horses, they're particularly sensitive. That's when we usually, if we see any fatal, incidences of death, it's usually with horses that are eating contaminated hay. So again, with blister beetles here, if we're wanting to do some scouting, you can use one of those sweep nets. There aren't any real, number thresholds with these. We're just checking for like presence or absence of those beetles. And really, it's the second and later cuttings that are at higher risk. Usually, we don't see them that early there to affect the first cutting. Although, when we've had earlier springs, we have seen some numbers, but usually they ramp up later in the season. So again, just like grasshoppers, scout different areas of the field. Pay attention to what species are present. So if there's ones that are striped, spotted, or ash gray, they can be a little more toxic. And then, as mentioned too, those blister beetles, of course, they're going to be more abundant in areas where you had a lot of grasshoppers the years previously. So for management, you want to harvest the alfalfa prior to peak bloom. Again, when you have all the flowers showing up, it's just a magnet for them that they'll all come in. You want to try to, if you're cutting the hay there, try to do it without using a conditioner to avoid crimping there or crushing the infested hay, because you don't want to squish those beetles and get them on that cantharidin on the hay. Allow it to the hay then to dry fully before raking. That gives those beetles time to fly away. They have wings there. They will leave once those plants are cut. You just got to give them some time. I've certainly been in fields that have been heavily infested, and then they go out, cut it, and you can just watch the windrows there as the beetles are all flying away, and that really drops the numbers that would be otherwise be there if you just didn't wait long enough there and just bailed it up. Don't spray infested fields. That actually has the opposite effect. So if you're killing those beetles, they're going to latch onto those plants, onto the stems, and you end up actually having more of them per bale. So then the last thing here, just some considerations for buying and selling hay. Of course, notify a buyer if those bales are infested. Use the first cutting there for horses if you can, because that's going to have certainly lower risk of having blister beetles present, and to avoid feeding hay from the field edges, because those are going to be we usually see an edge effect with blister beetles in a field. So here's a couple required slides, and there's my contact information. I think we're just about at time there. So Phil, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, Pat. Very informative presentation. So I believe Sarah has opened up our poll. It's just two short questions. It kind of helps us understand what you're seeing. So please take some time to click through that. Some things to announce. If you are I mentioned this earlier at the beginning. Oh, and there are no questions, Pat. So um, if you are a certified crop advisor, you will have to pay for that. Sarah did put explanation in the chat there. Um, Another thing is these crop hours are recorded. So if you want to rewatch them or someone you speak to someone interested in watching it, we do upload them to our extension website at no cost. So you can watch them whenever you want. That's extension.sdstate.edu/crop hour. Um, and then also another thing is at the end of the week, we'll send a survey to you. And the survey is just to get an idea for us. It's a few questions, whether, what we're preaching is helpful to you, what you feel, we could do better or change. And that'll come out at the end of the week. So keep an eye out for that. You certainly don't have to do it, but it does help us if you do. And then the last announcement is next week, week four. So starting Tuesday on January 27th and ending Thursday the 29th is plant pathology. So if you want to learn about plant diseases and whatnot, please tune in next week for that. So I believe with that, I don't see any more questions. Thank all of you for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow, where we discuss our corn insect pest. So with that, thank you and have a good day.